Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. Steven Hayward is a fellow at both the American Enterprise Institute and the Pacific Research Institute. He has published books about figures as disparate as Jimmy Carter and Winston Churchill, and later this year he will publish the second and final volume in his definitive work, The Age of Reagan. What concerns us today, however, is the 14th edition of Mr. Hayward's annual Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. I'm holding a hard copy in my hand, but you may also download this publication from the website of the Pacific Research Institute. Steve Hayward, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Peter. Good to be here.
Segment 1, 2 anniversaries. 1989, 20 years ago, what happened?
Well, the Exxon Valdez tanker disaster in Prince William Sound in Alaska. That was, one of the great catastrophes of modern times that really re-energized, I think, the environmental movement and the American public.
10 million gallons, over 10 million gallons of crude oil in a pristine, remote body of water. I Googled around, 500,000 seabirds dead. That's the small creatures, and 1 or 2 pods of killer whales virtually wiped out.
Right, and it was also almost 20 years to the date after the Santa Barbara oil blowout of 1969, which was one of the episodes that sparked the beginning of, I think, the modern environmental movement around 1970, precursor of the first Earth Day. And in both cases, what never got much coverage afterwards is both the Santa Barbara Channel and Prince William Sound recovered fairly fast.
Let me read to you John Rogers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yeah.
This is in 1989, within a few days after the Valdez spills all that goo into the Prince William Sound. Quote, discounting the loss of human life that occurred in the events at Chernobyl and Hiroshima, one can liken the impact of the Prince William Sound oil spill to an Alaskan event of similar magnitude.
Yeah, that's sort of typical.
It was never going. It would take decades to recover. That was the general expectation, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you generally saw. I mean, there was a long study done of the Santa Barbara oil spill by USC, and they had pretty much full recovery within about 2 years there of all the wildlife and health of the waters and so forth. Alaska, I think, was a similar time frame. Yeah, I mean, we don't like these things happening, and some of the steps we took, requiring double-hulled tankers, requiring captains to be sober when they drive their ships, things of those kind, I think, are sensible precautions to take.
Is it correct to draw this conclusion from the Exxon Valdez, from this condition of Prince William Sound today? And the conclusion would be, the planet is resilient.
Absolutely, I think that's something that we talk as though the Earth is so fragile that we're endlessly insulting it and it's doomed. And the problem with a lot of environmental thought today is that it's hard to tell when reasonable, if sometimes ill-informed, concern about problems that we create, and we do create a lot of them. It's hard to tell when that concern ends and a certain self-loathing or embrace of doomsaying for its own sake takes over. There's a good example this year, and something I mentioned in the report, is there's some data out of Central America that the Smithsonian Institution is starting to gather and collate. And what they're finding is that secondary forest growth, which is forests that have been cleared over the last century or two, are regrowing at a very rapid rate, maybe faster than we're clearing rainforests in the Amazon and places like this. Well, fine. And
so the mental image that everybody has of a Brazil rapidly being denuded is incorrect.
Well, we don't know.
It
might not be correct.
Okay.
I think my prediction is that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to change our thinking about forests around the world. We already have seen some new data out of the UN 2-3 years ago suggesting that forest conditions are improving much more rapidly than we think. Still a big problem in poor countries, Africa and Latin America.
Right.
But the point I was going to draw is that the New York Times wrote up this information, and there was a sentence in the New York Times story that environmentalists were outraged to hear this news. Well, you think about that for a moment. Why they're outraged to hear good news because it runs against the narrative that everything's always coming to an end, or to put a slightly more reasonable construction on it, they think it might lessen our commitment to taking steps to protect forests and species and other things that they want to see us do. I think that's a mistaken calculation. I think environmental concern, rightly understood, is now a settled middle-class value in wealthy countries and will become more so in other countries around the world as they prosper, and that's a key point.
The second anniversary that you mentioned in the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. 20 years ago, Exxon Valdez oil spill. 40 years ago,
the Cuyahoga River fire in Cleveland. And this is one that people still talk about. Things were so bad a river caught fire, which is true. But that's a very interesting story because it turned out that was not the first Cuyahoga River fire. That was about the 5th or 6th, and it wasn't even the largest one. They'd had some in the 30s and in the 50s that were much larger, did much more damage. In those days, people thought, I guess it's the price of progress. It may be nasty, but what can you do about it? Right. By 1969, it was intolerable that a river would catch fire in a major urban area. The axiom I put forward is, which is why it generalizes to the world, is the affluent society does not want to be the effluent society. And so, it turns out today that Cuyahoga has made an extraordinary recovery. I mean, throughout the 70s, people would go do, biological surveys, and they'd find 2 fish, not 2 species, just 2. Now, the most recent surveys show that there's a lot of different species of fish have come back. It's been substantially cleaned up. 40 years later, right.
40 species.
40. I forget the number I report in this year. I don't remember
I read it last
figures,
night.
but I say 40.
Steelhead trout,
right.
northern pike.
Right.
Right.
And the Great Lakes in general have made a substantial comeback. I mean, most of the measures of toxins in fish and shellfish and water conditions there have shown extraordinary improvements in the last 40 years.
So the late Gene Kirkpatrick, ambassador to the United Nations, was talking about our record in human rights, but it applies in some way to the environment as well. We must learn to face the truth about ourselves, no matter how good it might be.
I haven't thought of that, but I like that.
Segment 2, global warming and the bewildered layman, by which I mean me. You write, quote, of the growth of the number of news stories that combine the phrase climate change with the phrase tipping point, which indicates journalists who don't want to think very hard. Explain that.
Well, tipping point became a cliche after the success of Malcolm Gladwell's great book, right? And so I just started doing a nexus search for the number of stories that put those 2 terms together. And it went from something like 200 in 2002 to something like 5,000 last year. So this just becomes a go-to cliche. I think it's a macro button on a lot of journalists' computers. Experts worry we're reaching a tipping point, or as I like to joke, we may as well just mix all our metaphors and agree that we've arrived at a perfect storm of tipping points on climate change.
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that I look at Vanity Fair. And in a recent Vanity Fair, that back page, there's that's Proust questionnaire, and Jane Fonda filled it out. And it was something like your fondest hope, and it was that we save the planet before it's too late. So there is this notion that the planet is so fragile, and we humans represent such a grave threat to it, that in our lifetimes, we may go so far as somehow or other to destroy the planet. And you view that as ridiculous on the face of it?
Well, it's an extraordinary conceit, on the one hand, to think that one, we can destroy the planet, or B, that we can just turn around and save it, just like that. I start collecting these cliches. I think the first one I have, there's Fairfield Osborne back in 1947 who wrote the first modern environmental tract called Our Plundered Planet, when you can get from the title what it's like. But I think it was the Secretary General of the United Nations who said, we have 10 years left to master these problems. Well, that Secretary General was not Ban Ki-moon, it was U Thant in 1970. So 40 years later, we're still here. We keep missing these 10-year deadlines. Lately, some of the global warming alarmists, I tend not to like to use that vocabulary, but it really does fit, like James Hansen say, we've got less than 10 years left to do something about this. Al Gore said the same thing. My question to them is 10 years from now, come what may, are they going to shut up? I think I know the answer to that question. It's an irrepressible trait that they have.
Let me take you through a couple of the trends that you discuss in the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. With regard to global warming, global trends in sea ice.
Yeah,
Explain. Here I really am the layman. I just don't understand what is going on and what does it mean.
There has been a measurable shrinkage in Arctic sea ice, the North Pole sea ice, over the last 30 years. There isn't any doubt about that. There is some doubt about the causes. It's not necessarily warmer air temperatures, although there's been some of that. There's an awful lot of the peer-reviewed scientific literature that says it's changes in wind patterns and some changes in ocean currents, and also lately, just in the last few weeks, more attention to so-called black carbon, which is dark particles that the naked eye don't pick up, but that absorb more warmth from the sun. That's caused it.
But isn't the shrinkage of the Arctic ice cap overwhelming evidence on the face of it that the globe is warming and something dangerous is happening here, rising sea levels and all the rest of it?
Well, the first half of that statement is true. The second half may not be. The first half was, isn't this evidence that something is happening? Yes.
Right.
That it's dangerous, that's much less clear, because we only have about 30, 40 years of data on sea ice. We have some.
You're a man who likes millennia of data?
Yeah, well, especially when you're talking about climates, which run in long cycles. We have some evidence going back earlier this century about ice in the 1920s and 30s being pretty far back. We didn't have satellite measurements then. We didn't even have surveys, so we don't really know with a high degree of certainty about this. We have folklore from Viking sailors, Chinese sailors from about the year 1000 AD of talking of sailing in a near ice-free Arctic. And we have a reasonable idea from some of these accounts of where they were. So this may not be extraordinary.
So there
yes,
are at least
things have
hints
changed.
that there may be a kind of large cycle going on.
Yes.
Large meaning large over time.
Right.
Now tell us about all these terrible increases in storms and droughts that Al Gore is always warning us about.
Well, in the United States, we have what we call the Palmer Drought Index, and it shows no discernible trends over the 20th century. It's sort of gone up and down, very erratically, because we call that weather most of the time. And tropical storms, we had that spectacular year culminating with Katrina in 2005,
Right.
and everyone thought this is surely a sign from God, if nothing else, of climate change.
Either God or Al Gore.
Right. And it turns out that the long-term trend in the tropical storms has been down the last 15, 20 years. This was sort of those extraordinary years, and neither the number or intensity of storms is increasing.
So on that one, Al Gore is just full of bourgeois. That's just nonsense. All right. Now, is the globe warming?
Yes.
Is it
Well,
warming?
let me qualify that, though.
All right.
It warmed fairly substantially for about a 20-year period from the late 70s to the late 90s. And for the last 10 years, it's been flat or slightly declining. And, a couple of years might just be noise. But now this is starting to look like a problem for the computer models that say we should be going up pretty much in a straight line.
Can I just ask, I've never heard, so to speak, the other side's argument so well that I bet you know how they answer this question, but I have yet to hear a good answer to the question. Average temperature goes up by about 1 degree centigrade over the 20th century. But it is well established that most of the rise takes place in the first half of the century, which is precisely when automobiles, all the human emissions of CO2 would have been the lowest. How come?
Oh, well, the explanations for this get very confusing. But lately the explanations are there are cycles of ocean temperatures that we don't fully understand yet. But that has a fairly large impact on temperature. And what they say is that ultimately greenhouse gases will overwhelm that. Well, maybe they're right about that. I'm skeptical about that because I think our mastery of ocean dynamics is not that complete yet. And so I think they're sticking with what they know. But so the argument is between the end of World War II and the late 70s, you had essentially cold oceans.
I see.
And now they're saying we're having cold oceans again, and this is delaying the warming our models say should be happening. But I think this is this should raise more questions in our mind about our confidence of our grasp of this.
So you grant that the globe is warming. Do you grant that it is because of human activity?
Partially, almost certainly it's partially due to human activity. Okay. Sure, I don't know what proportion to assign to.
And does it then follow from that, let me put it in a stronger way. Doesn't it then follow from that we should be, if not alarmed, then wary and alert and taking certain precautions?
Yes, I think it's worth taking seriously, and it's worth thinking about a long-term transition to a lower carbon energy system. But I think you do other things. I think you would explore the whole field of what's known as geoengineering. There's a lot to that, but the idea is if solar radiation is our problem, we have lots of ideas that are fairly low cost of how you would deflect some solar radiation. Deliberately injecting some particles in the atmosphere. Some ideas involve a fleet of ships, maybe 300 or 400, that would spray salt water into the air to increase cloud cover over the oceans and reflect some sunlight. That's much cheaper than this idea of we're going to all go to solar power and biofuels and get rid of coal and oil and gas in the next 40 years, which is a multi-trillion-dollar proposition just for this country, let alone the whole world. If the rest of the world doesn't do it, nothing we do will make any difference.
Okay, you set up segment 3,
okay.
Rich and Poor, Steven Hayward, quote. Steven Hayward writing in the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. Quote, not surprisingly, the media and green campaigners in the United States completely overlooked a report entitled The World's Worst Pollution Problems. Give us some of those of the world's worst pollution problems.
Well, it's things like completely unregulated and uncontrolled mine waste in developing countries. Right. It's heavy metals in waters and just really awful water quality. Indoor air pollution, and by that I mean not it comes from your stove cooking on your wolf range in your nice suburban house, but it means the people cooking on cow dung and sticks in their mud huts in India and Africa, where the mortality rates from that are phenomenally high. Those are, and the point is that this
report was not put together by right-wing kooks. This report was by Green Cross of Switzerland, as I recall.
Right. And the point is that all those leading problems are problems of poor countries, not of rich countries. In the last few days, the American Lung Association put out its annual report of the most polluted American cities. So I went and checked those cities, and in every single one of them, air pollution is falling. Moreover, if you take the World Bank's list of the worst air polluted cities in the world, not a single American or European city cracks the top 50. The worst American city for air pollution is still Los Angeles, where I grew up, when I couldn't breathe as a kid in the 60s because of the smog. It's, I think, 66th on the World Bank list. So, the point is that it's...
that the Los Angeles, particulate matter in Los Angeles declined 27% in the last decade.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And that's on top of large declines in the decades before that.
Briefly, I want to probe this notion of rich and poor, but can you briefly explain the concept of energy intensity?
Yes, in one sentence, it's how much energy you use per dollar of economic output.
And the point there is that the West is getting more and more energy intense.
Yes, it had been for a very long time.
So now let me, as the layman here, I think I see a curve. That is to say, if you have on one axis pollution and on the other axis wealth, the United States would have gone through, when it was poor and agrarian, very little pollution. Then you go through the Civil War, the 19th century, the whole Industrial Revolution, and you get the industries in Akron and Cleveland belching out so much garbage into the Cuyahoga River that it bursts into flame.
Right.
And then you get high tech and wealthy, and people start to care about the environment, and you go back down this sort of, so it's a snake that has eaten a rodent. And that would be a kind of a typical pattern, right?
There's actually an academic name for that. It's called the environmental Kuznets curve, after Simons Kuznets, who worked this out in the 50s for poverty and
You mean
equality.
I'm half a century late on that one?
Well, the EKC, as it's called in the trade, the Kuznets curve for the environment, it follows exactly that pattern. You can see it for England. You can see it for a lot of countries. You can see it now for Mexico. Air pollution in Mexico City, a pretty polluted place, has now been falling for the last 10 years.
Okay, so here's the point. The point is, if you pollute more as you industrialize, and you don't get over that hump until you're a pretty modern, affluent society, the gravest threat to the world's environment today are the development of China and India. Is that not correct?
Right. Well, yes, except for a couple of points. One is that they can short circuit that curve. Their curve can be shallower
That's
than
exactly
ours.
okay. So how does that? Because you don't want to be put in the position of choosing between having hundreds of millions of people climb out of poverty and being able to breathe clean air. So there's a way of changing that pattern now.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, just pick one example. The Chinese are buying cars like crazy, but they're not buying the equivalent of a '57 Chevy in its environmental profile. They've actually adopted the European Union tailpipe standards, which are quite low and pretty close to our tailpipe standards. A brand new American car today, the few we're still making, give out less than 1% the amount of pollution that a car gave out 20 years ago. That's how much.
Just 20 years ago?
Just 20 years ago. That's how much we've cleaned up cars. It's been a great technological achievement of our auto engineers that no one seems to know about except pain-loving antiquarians like me who follow the data. So their curve will be shorter. But look, I mean,
what about all the coal they're burning, though?
Well, no, this is a problem. I think they will. They used to build, very simple, old-school coal plants with no emission controls. Well, they're now starting to build them with, American-style state-of-the-art emissions controls. So they're going to lower in China. So lower their sulfur dioxide, which is one of the big pollutants you worry about for human health. That doesn't lower your carbon dioxide. That's still a very expensive and difficult proposition that we haven't mastered. But that's a separate problem from basic pollution problems.
You see where I'm going here. Doesn't China, to satisfy Al Gore, doesn't China need to build about 1,000 nuclear plants?
Yes.
It does?
Yeah. And so do we, but maybe not 1,000, but a couple hundred would do.
So if Al Gore is serious, it follows that the grave threat to the environment is the development of China and India. And if he is serious about seeing those people prosper and thrive, then he should be embracing nuclear technology, correct?
Yes. This is
there a flaw there? Is that too simple?
Well, here's a factoid for Al Gore and everyone else. if the United States generated the same proportion of electricity that France generates with nuclear power, we would have been under our Kyoto Protocol target, and we could have ratified that treaty without any worry in the world 10 years ago.
France is 70%?
About 75%,
75%.
right. If we generate 75% of our electricity with the nuclear power, our greenhouse gas emissions would be about 35% lower than they are today.
You know the
And so the environmentalists bear a large part of the blame for our current greenhouse gas profile in this country, because they're the ones who blocked us in the 70s.
Last question in this segment. You know the environmental movement in this country in great detail. Are there people who have the respect of that movement who are beginning to advocate for nuclear power in this country?
Quietly, there are a number who will tell you privately that they are rethinking their position and they think maybe we did make a mistake 30 years ago. They will also tell you candidly, if you're in a bar over a drink, that they're terrified of the reaction of the people on their mailing list if they come out publicly in favor of nuclear power. But some of the groups have edged away. You know, environmental defense, even occasionally the NRDC on a good day will say, well, we're not really as opposed to nuclear power if you can solve waste and a couple of other problems that, you know, have some basis and reason. So there's some softening there.
5 years from now, will leading environmentalists be demanding nuclear power? What sort of time frame? No.
I doubt it. I think that's always going to be a tough one for them.
All right.
Because that's environmental correctness number one, is we don't like nuclear power.
All right. Segment 4, the deep structure of environmentalism. Steven Hayward, I quote you again. I quote from the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. Quote, the population bomb can be seen as a precursor to the global warming crisis of today, arresting assertion number 1. As far back as the early decades of the 20th century, the population crisis was put forward as the justification for global governance and coercive, non-consensual rule, striking assertion number 2. How is the population bomb the precursor to global warming?
Well, just a very brief background. What brought this to my attention was reading and reviewing Matthew Connelly's fabulous book called Fatal Misconception that came out last year. And it's a detailed history of the population control movement.
Matthew Connelly is who?
Oh, sorry, he's a Columbia historian, a person who, you gather from reading it,
is a serious person.
Is published by Harvard University Press. He's, I think, tenured faculty member at Columbia. Seems to be sort of a liberal in the ordinary sense, so, you know, not somebody like me. But a savage indictment of the population control movement. You can gather from the title, Fatal Misconception. And the book not only talks about the facts they got wrong, but also the political corruption. You had all these institutions created around the world that had an interest in hyping this as a crisis because it was in their own interest, and it built up structures for them and these self-perpetuating machines. And I'm reading it thinking, this sounds exactly like the climate change racket with the IPCC and all the rest of it. But for a long time I've thought, even before I read that book, that you look back at the population bomb, and you know the population bomb.
Just give us the thesis in a capsule.
Well, we were having exponential population growth, and you know the most famous advocate was Paul Ehrlich, whose book sold millions of copies.
By the 70s, there would be starvation across the
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And you look back now, and I mean, even he has admitted. I've been on a couple of panels with him. He's admitted he overshot his estimates. You know, I think he's not entirely wrong. But the point is that the idea that the population growth. We quadrupled our population in the 20th century. The idea that that was going to cause environmental problems was right. It still does cause population problems. However,
environmental problems.
Environmental problems. However, we way overestimated the dimensions of that crisis and what was necessary to address it. All these ideas of having population control by governments were unnecessary and wrong, and as I say, are political problems. He talks about the huge human rights abuses in India. Never mind China's one-child policy people have heard about. Things they did in India were appalling.
All right, okay, so where do you see in the global warming environmental movement the urge toward global governance and coercive rule?
Oh, well, I mean, there's talks that we need to have a global environmental agency of some kind that would have powers for a global taxation to control carbon emissions, global regulation of energy, and so forth. I mean, this is openly argued by people like Gus Speth at the Yale School of the Environment. And the point is, now we look back on the population bomb and realize we overestimated this.
Right.
And I think in 20 and 30 years, we're going to look back on climate change and say, real phenomenon, but we overestimated the extent of it, and all these policy prescriptions were completely idiotic. I think that's my long-term prediction. And costly. And I think we're going to look back on it and say, this was like the population bomb. We had it way out of proportion.
I quote you again. Malthusianism is a hardy perennial. Explain what Malthusianism is, and then explain why it has such a persistent appeal.
Yeah, well, it's after the famous economist Thomas Malthus from the 19th century who said essentially human population growth will outstrip resources or the carrying capacity of the planet and will lead eventually to collapse, starvation, disaster.
We're lemmings. We're lemmings.
Right.
The population explodes, then we
Right.
starve ourselves out.
Right, and you know, the thing that he missed, this has been the standard critique of him ever since, was he missed technological improvement, productivity improvements in farming, and the fact that the human species, while we do lots of bad things, are also not complete idiots, and we fix our problems. It's often messy, always contentious, sometimes less than perfect, most of the time less than perfect, but you know, we are capable of making progress as a species. So he missed all of that, and there have been, you know, lots and lots of refutations, but Malthus always makes a comeback. And
Why?
well, I think it feeds into, you know, I think there's a deep-seated hardwiring of some people that they really like, you know, they like to believe in the end of the earth because it makes them happy. That sounds odd, but you know, I really do think that for some environmentalists, I don't like to paint with a broad brush that's all of them, but there's some of the noisiest environmentalists who drive a lot of this. The idea of the human apocalypse as a substitute for the religious apocalypse, which exist in almost all major religious creeds.
All right. Now, in the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, you also write, however, about polling data suggesting that the claims of the greenies are losing their purchase on ordinary citizens. Explain.
Yeah, well, the polling data, I follow this closely as a political scientist. For the first time ever in Gallup's poll, they do every March, the number of people who say the economy is more important than the environment now gets a majority position, I think 58% in the latest poll. That's never happened before, even in previous recessions. One marker is one you actually alluded to in an earlier segment, which was Vanity Fair. At the end of last year, the American Publishing Association, or whatever the magazine trade group is, put out a report saying that the green issues that everyone does in April for Earth Day were the worst-selling newsstand issues of the year for everybody. And I actually predicted a year ago that someday these magazines are going to quit doing the green issue. And sure enough, this April, Vanity Fair said, nope, not going to do that. We're going to put Gisele Bündchen on the cover.
Right.
And put out a press release saying we're still committed to green causes, but we're just not going to waste an issue for this anymore that doesn't sell.
Right.
So there's lots of little signs like this that in one sentence, I think environmentalists are finally starting to wear out their welcome with the public. People are still, I think, you know, want to be reasonable about the environment. They want to recycle and do good things, but they're tuning out
Final
the
question.
relentless greeniness.
Final question in this segment. William F. Buckley famously said that he'd rather be governed by the first 400 names in the Boston telephone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. Is the green movement versus the polling data you're talking about, in some way can it be laid on that template where this is an elite, the cluelessness of the elites all over again, and ordinary people sort of cottoning on to reality more quickly? Or is that unfair?
Well, I mean, the way I'd put it is my variation of Buckley's theme is it's not exactly a symmetry, but I like to say that the environment is much too important to be left to the environmentalists because they'll just screw it up and take things to extremes. I think that's what's happened with a lot of our policy. I think there's a great shakeout and reckoning coming in all this. But I do think, to recur to an earlier point, that environmentalism, reasonably understood, is a settled middle-class value because we're prosperous. Nobody wants to go back to the days when you dump anything in a river, that we have, you know, smokestacks that are unregulated, and you know, nobody's proposing to go back to that, and we're not going to go back to that. People don't want that, but I think we're probably going to move to a new equilibrium where we get this in a better balance.
Segment 5, final segment, the Green Scorecard for Bush and Obama. The environment and George W. Bush. You write in the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, quote, although final data for 2008, his last year in office, are not yet available, we can reach some tentative conclusions for the first 7 years of the Bush administration that run directly counter, almost across the board, to the popular impression that the Bush years were a tale of unmitigated environmental degradation, close quote. Stephen Hayward rises to defend the environmental record of George W. Bush.
Well, look, one of the things about environmental policy is that, for better or worse, and often for worse, it's on automatic pilot. I mean, we have long waves of the way we do these things around the country, and even a president, were he or she determined to try and wreck this, couldn't do it, for reasons that would take a while to explain. Back in 2000, when Bush was proposing what I thought were some very sensible changes to the Clean Air Act and asking Congress to change the legislation, environmentalists were saying he's going to gut the Clean Air Act, air pollution is going to soar, even with administrative changes. So that's when I decided to offer my variation of the Ehrlich-Simon bet. And I offered to publicize this in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. I'd bet anyone $1,000 that at the end of 8 years in office, if Bush had 8 years, ozone and particulate levels would be lower than when he took office. No one would take that bet. I cornered Carl Pope from the Sierra Club on NPR radio one day and proposed the bet, and he immediately changed the subject because, of course, he knew I was right.
You were right.
Interestingly, John Kerry in the 2004 election actually phrased it right. He actually said the argument is that air pollution won't fall as fast under Bush's policy as it would under the current policy. I think you can dispute that. But so we're arguing now is not whether we're going to lower air pollution, but how fast and by what means and at what cost.
All right.
And so what you heard was completely ridiculous from the media and all the environmental activists that were going to send pollution through the roof and so forth.
The environment and Barack Obama. Let's begin with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the question of carbon dioxide. During the Bush administration, the EPA staff found that CO2 is indeed a pollutant, but then, and here I quote Time magazine, hold on to your chair, quote, Administrator Steven Johnson delayed the process of regulating CO2, part of the Bush administration's general obstructionism on climate change, close quote. President Obama's EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson has already sent the White House an endangerment finding on CO2, and regulations are certain to follow. Okay, do you rejoice?
Well, in a
Was Bush obstructionist, and do you rejoice that that the EPA is now going to regulate CO2?
A couple of observations. I predict that with another 4 or 5 years, the Obama administration's climate policy is going to end up in about the same place as the Bush administration's climate policy, which was, in one sentence, the only thing that can work is if we figure out a way to make low-carbon energy cheaper so that the whole world can adopt it. Now, they didn't get very far with that because no one knows how to do that. That's a long-term problem. Obama's going to end up there too for some economic reasons. The other thing I'd say is, if you're a serious environmentalist or even, a crazy environmentalist, I'm not sure how excited you'd be about having things regulated by the Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act is slow and was designed for a different kind of problem. And although on paper you could theoretically regulate an awful lot of stuff through the Clean Air Act, down to this building that we're in now, could be subject to Clean Air Act regulation, it takes 5 to 10 years or longer to get those rules in place and get them through the administrative process. Then they're going to go to court and be litigated. So that process is going to be very slow, and mostly this is thought to be a big political bluff. This will put pressure on Congress to do something like pass cap and trade, except now I think it's backfiring because I think you have enough Democrats saying, wait, we don't like cap and trade, there's lots of problems with it. Let the EPA do it.
Cap and trade, this is the other big Obama, perhaps the big Obama initiative. Cap and trade, explain it.
Well, it's emissions trade. The idea is you would put a cap on carbon emissions, and actually that cap would go down year by year.
So if you're burning coal to produce energy in North Dakota, suddenly the amount of emissions you may produce is capped.
But here's the trick. Either you have to use less coal, you have to switch to natural gas, which costs twice as much and run up your rates, or you have to buy allowances to emit the current amount that you're emitting, which means your prices will go up either way.
And you purchase them from?
The federal government, unless they give the allowances away. One of the things I'm watching this in real time. I've testified twice to the House Energy Committee on this. We say we want to raise the price of carbon, fine, but then, semicolon, we don't want anyone to pay higher prices for it. Well, this can't possibly work, and this is why the gears have ground to a halt on this. I think it's not going to pass. I think we're going to pass something that will have lots of mandates for renewable energy and research and lots of nonsense. And
the reason it won't pass is that there are a lot of Democratic members of the House and Senate who come from states that are high coal burning states, correct?
Yes, I mean, Indiana generates 90% of its electricity from coal.
So if you're Evan Bayh representing Indiana in the Senate, you do not want all your folks suddenly have to pay much higher heating bills in the winter.
Right, and so the game that's going on right now behind closed doors is, can we bribe these people off by giving them enough rebates and kickbacks to industries and ratepayers in their states to get a yes vote from them? And I think that's going to be a very hard game to make work.
If you could offer President Obama one sentence of advice on the environment, what would you say?
Oh, jeepers, I don't know.
2 sentences then, Steve.
Well, the thing is, I'd say, I might say this. Go ahead and wink at us next time you make one of your green pronouncements. I don't think, in my heart of hearts, that this is really a high priority for him. I think he's an old Chicago urban Pole. He cares much more about health care and taxes and the budget and ACORN and things like this. And I don't think this is really next to his heart. I think he just talks the talk because it's part of the coalition he needs to talk to.
Steven Hayward, author of the 2009 edition, the 14th edition of the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, downloadable from the website of the Pacific Research Institute. Steven Hayward, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.